All right, so the next time to the next session. Now we are going to focus more on a productive way of building load testing scripts or scenarios. Here the idea is to describe how to build web UI or client server architecture scripting. So give all the tips about scripting, because when it comes to load testing, if you don't have robust scripts, then you can ask yourself if it makes sense to really run the on-shoot test. Your test is just a generic errors, just to measure exceptions. So here it's going to be a practical session for those who is doing a lot of end-to-end testing and requires to have a robust. So this session is going to be presented by Arjan van Berg. So Arjan has been working in test automation since 10 years now, doing a different type of test and performance test on web services, web UI, waterfall forms with any type of tools. So when Arjan reached out to us, he was suggesting talk about related to scripting. I thought it was meaningful because it's good to talk about automation. It's good to talk about new technologies, but I think we still need to remind the basics, because it doesn't make sense to automate if at least the core principle, the core basics of load testing is not there. So Arjan, I will let you start your presentation and start sharing your screen. So I have to say. Take my webcam.
I can share my screen.
Yes. All right. So I can see your screen. I can see the Blue Jeans web UI.
Which one do you see? The with notes or not?
No, I see the PowerPoint. No, I see the notes now. The presenter mode, not the slide.
So I have to
select the other screen.
I can select the other screen.
In PowerPoint, when you do the slide show, you can select which screen you want to send the slide deck. Select the one that you're currently displayed.
This one.
You only have one screen? Okay, now I can see the slide. Yeah, perfect.
Okay, this is one screen. It's now showing full screen?
Yeah, full screen, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, my presentation is like back to the core related to scripting. So it's called a generic approach or best practices, how you name it. So I want to give tips and tricks, what I've done in the last 10 years, because I have a lot of scripting experience. So I want to share my knowledge. So in general, this presentation is about scripting HTTP level, but sometimes you need to script on browser or GUI level. And yeah, that my knowledge become for the future available for other ones. So the presentation is not about scoping test and shift left, shift right, and that kind of stuff. It's focused on developing load test scripts, because a reliable script is needed within every stage of the development cycle. So it can be available on all layers. Okay, you can have knowledge of a lot of things, JavaScript, HTTP, whatever, but the experience you need to build a load test. So, and I've seen a lot of scripts from other starting engineers, and they start with scripting, but often they forget some things. So you need to think about a lot. So in this presentation, I want to mention all stuff you need to know to build good and reliable scripts. So it's divided in 3 points. It's called scripting best practices. So first it starts with test data. And then you have to script, of course, through the web UI. I give an introduction of that, and you can script on 2 layers, HTTP or on GUI level. And the third one is web services. It's not the main part of this presentation, but I want to mention this because I need to be complete. So that is topic 1. Topic 2 is how to validate the load scripts. And topic 3 is how do you configure scenarios and that kind of stuff. So the best practices. Okay. I want to start with test data because I've seen a lot of times people start scripting and they forgot, oh, what about test data? So test data is really, really important because if you start scripting without the right test data in place, it's almost impossible to develop reliable scripts. So you need to identify the happy flows, and you need to identify the test data for all test scenarios. And that's easy to say, but in practice, it's often difficult. The first one, you need unique accounts, IDs, to handle all users. Often you get only 1 or 2 or 3 test accounts and you can do the load test. But it's a good practice to have unique IDs for the load test. So you can handle all load profiles like stress test, peak load, and that kind of stuff. Yeah, it's also good to know, of course, it needs to be production-like. We can use stubs and that kind of stuff. And as already said before, it's very, very important that the test data is in place. And also a topic I want to mention that is the test data should be linked to a user ID so that each user knows or sees his own test data. And I will show in the next slides what I mean with that. If you see this slide, topic 1, if a user has unique shopping articles, then the data is related to a user session. So if a user buys something, it needs to be unique. So you don't order for each user a mouse or a headset or whatever, but you need to have different topics. Also, if you want to test session related stuff, then it's also a good practice to have the sense to have the data within the user session. And the next slide is mentioned what I mean with that. So you can create a load script with a user A orders a smartwatch, user B a smartwatch, user C a smartwatch, but it needs to be like a user orders a smartwatch, use product X, user B, other things, user C, other things. So for that case, each user has unique text data. Okay, so that's related to this. Another one you can do, for instance, it's a theoretical example, but I've seen it in practice. You can do a search action. Let's say a user A search for birds, and a user B search for cars, and user C search for whatever. Then you expect the results like birds. The second one, you expect cars and that kind of stuff. There's a mistake in the slide, but what I've seen is in real life, user A searches for birds, user B searches for cars, and then there was a session data issue. So user A gets the results from user B. So in this case, there is a problem with this data, session data. So maybe something with the thread pool or what kind of stuff. But you can only find this issue when you have unique test data for each and every user. If you don't do it, if you do it like this, let's say each user has the same product, you never can find such kind of topics with a load test. So I want to stress that each user has unique test data. It's not only for caching and that kind of stuff, but also for session related stuff. Okay, so that was the main topics about test data. Of course, there's more to mention, but this is only the most important ones. It needs to be production-like and it needs to be session or user related. Okay, then about scripting. Of course, you have a lot of GUI frameworks, Angular, React, and you can name 10 or 20 user frameworks. A lot of AX asynchronous stuff, and sometimes you have a WebSocket channel, sometimes you have polling, long polling, asynchronous, whatever. A lot of client JavaScript. So you may think how to handle this in a load script, because it's very technical, but at the end, it's still an HTTP request to the server. So, and a load test is, for instance, to stress the backend. So it's HTTP. But I want to mention in the next slides when to use HTTP and when maybe to switch to GUI. First, HTTP protocol. My common practice is it's open door, but start simple. So start with a simple user flow, make a recording, and after a recording, make sure that unneeded URLs are removed, because I've seen recordings from people which contains a virus update or an update from software or Google Analytics or whatever, but remove first the unneeded URLs which are not related to your system and the test. And then identify all dynamic data. And of course, there are a lot of tools which use correlation stuff for that. But if you don't have a fancy tool, you can do a recording twice and compare all requests and responses, and you can correlate manual things because yeah, it's simply, but it's about all the dynamic stuff. So the first topic is record it twice, and then I always start first with the session IDs, so that I log in and the session is working correctly. And if that's working correctly, then you have to parameterize all dynamic data like GUIDs, dates, timestamps, so everything what looks or what you can correlate, because you can see if you see a dynamic number or a long before base digit, then you know it needs to be correlated. Of course, the dynamic data is fetched from the server response with expressions. And then the last one, a lot of tools use, or you can use XPath or JSON path or whatever. My personal flavor is use regular expressions with grouping, because that works always. So if you learn regular expressions, then you can use it almost in any tool, and you can almost get everything from the response what you need in other requests. Okay. Okay, I did it wrong. Yes, and then of course you need to get dynamic data. So dynamic data is yeah. So each user needs to simulate different data, so to avoid responses from cache. Also, a good practice is to use a few transactions with wrong test data. So because if you fill in each user clean, then each user is like a robot and it's always entering the right phone number and always entering the right fields. But if it is more, you have to make it more realistic. So you have to make some transactions with the wrong data, and then I mean with wrong data, wrong test data, which also occurs in the real life. And then the second bullet is really important, checks, because checks are often not mature or not proper enough. So you need to check on errors, of course, but also on expected results. And you have to make assertions also unique. So you can get it from a table. And the absence of assertions may lead in misleading results, because if you don't have the right assertions, then you maybe you set transactions to OK which are not proper or correctly ended. Also, best practice is that that you run the scripts to multiple environments, then your scripts get also more mature. It's also that if you make, and that's again related to the other one, don't enter always the right data, but in practice users rarely log out, so don't assume that everyone logs out in the real world, so don't design your scripts like that. The third bullet is like headers and cookies. I see a lot of people correlating headers, cookies, and that kind of stuff, but they are almost handled automatically within any tool. So don't pay attention to that because it's for free. And then this one about think time and pacing. I see scripts with no think time. I see scripts with fixed think time, but those 4 bullets are my best practices. So don't use a constant think time, but use a distribution. And for example, 50%, 5 seconds. And also an important one is pacing, and that's sometimes or often forgotten. Because if you don't have pacing, then your script will maybe run too fast, or you can't even compare the scripts with a previous run, because pacing is needed for to get the time frame in the same scope, and I will show this in the next slide. Think time and pacing are both a kind of delay, but if the response time is 10 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 seconds, 10 seconds, then the iterations run like that. But what happens if the response time is 50 seconds or 5 seconds? Then your script will run faster, and you get a higher load. So this is the important one: use pacing to get steady load. Because with pacing, you have guaranteed that the time which takes the script is always on the same time period. And I see sometimes pacing on transaction level. I prefer it on script level and set the think times dynamically per script. But yeah, you can debate about that. Okay. Another one is keep load scripts simple. I have seen load scripts, and I've made them with a lot of custom flow logic. How do you call it? With separate user flows or combined user flows in one script. So my opinion is keep load script simple as possible, and don't create a lot of logic in it. So the second one, don't try to write custom error handling. Sometimes I see people do retry save or retry this or retry that. I think it can happen in the real world, but it's not a good practice, I think. The test should be independent. So create script for insert order and create script for whatever. So don't mix user flows in one script. If data is shared between scripts, then you can share it in a temp file or in a queue, or so Neolot has a queue mechanism for that. Loadrunner has a virtual table space for that, or it can even be a file. But you can share IDs which are needed between scripts. And the last bullet is avoid checks, because I see sometimes people write scripts and do checks in the database and that kind of stuff, but that also not happen in the real world. So that may have influence on your load scenario. So don't do that. Maybe even at the end of the load test, outside your results, but not within the load scenario itself. Okay. Yeah, then you may think, what about Ajax stuff and that kind of stuff? I know it's difficult to explain in slides. Maybe a next presentation or whatever, then I can give a hands-on or a real case, but I want to present in 2 slides or 2 or 3 slides what I've seen. Sometimes you see polling or heartbeat requests. So if you see during a recording a polling or heartbeat or that kind of stuff, so repeated stuff, then my best practice is delete all the same requests and put one of them in a loop, and then check with an extractor the state of the response, and then you know the pattern. Sometimes the solution can block the test flow, then you need to fork a separate thread. I have an example of that, but that is maybe another session. But so if you see a repeated request, then you have to do it like this. Sometimes you observe asynchronous requests, and they are recorded sequential. But yeah, in the normal browser, they are executed in the same time. But due to my honest opinion, a load test is, of course, a load test to stress the backend, and the GUI. Yeah, if you really test the GUI end to end, then you need maybe all requests on timing level 100% precise. But if you use it for load testing, if it trashes the backend, then it should be maybe sufficient if you group the async requests together, and that you send them as near as possible. Or if it is really needed, then you can fork a separate thread in your load script, but that's up to you. Okay. Yeah, as I said, the requests are maybe sent synchronous, but the timing is maybe less accurate due to the browser end-to-end. But maybe we can have a discussion about that. What is really the thing for the backend load? The last one is, to my opinion, important, because sometimes if you do a recording of a lot of asynchronous stuff or polling stuff, then the requests are in the wrong transaction. So you need to be sure that that the requests are in the transaction which you expect, because else you have a report of your load test and then the transactions have other requests than you expect. Or the timing is not accurate because the transactions doesn't correlate to the request below it. I also have seen application with WebSocket channels, and WebSocket is a kind of bidirectional pipe with a lot of messages. Async, so you don't know when the answer comes, and so you can see it as a big pipe, and all requests come through that and responses. So you need, of course, measuring response times can be challenging. I know that Neolode has a feature for that, but again, assertions and extracting parameters is very sometimes very difficult. You need to write extraction stuff which is sensible for all responses. So you need to pay attention to that. You often need multiple threads, and due to the async stuff, it can be very difficult to debug. It's fun for technical people, but sometimes it's a challenge. So this is a picture of a WebSocket example, and in this case it was an application which has a GUI on the server. So the GUI state was on the server, and all GUI events were sent through a WebSocket channel. So it was a terrible stuff to correlate everything. We handle this technically, but for maintenance reasons, switch to GUI level. So in the next slides, I will give some advice what to do and when to use GUI or when to use HTTP, because it's not black or white. But as you can see in this slide, if you have 60 plus responses with this awful JSON stuff, then it's very difficult. Okay, and this slide shows some async requests. You can see it in the XHR tab of Chrome, and then you see parallel stuff. But I explained that already in the slide before. Okay. Then scripting on GUI level. So the first slide, the section before was about HTTP, and then GUI level. A lot of vendors, there are now 3, 4, 5 vendors which are saying GUI level is the answer on all questions. So yeah, they say use GUI and then all problems are gone. But I want to give some things about it, some experience. Because GUI is, level scripting is for sure not record and playback. I also want to mention that GUI level tests are used for backend load testing. If you want to test the front end to end, in my opinion, it's a different test. GUI object identification needs also a learning curve, and you need to gain experience with it. So it's different than HTTP scripting. You need XPath expressions and timing stuff and that kind of. So it's more test automation experience. A lot of vendors say the maintenance go to 0 and you don't have maintenance anymore. GUI scripts needs also maintenance because the DOM and the XPath expressions can change over builds. So you need to correlate that again. Sometimes you get pop-up windows. It can be an issue. Assertions, which are easy in HTTP scripting because assertions, you get a response and then can do a regular expression on that kind of stuff. But within GUI, you need to scrape the state from the GUI. So assertions is more time consuming in GUI scripting than in HTTP scripting. And errors needs also to be scraped from the screen. So it's also more time consuming. Okay, and then a slide of GUI versus HTTP. My personal experience, I say that if possible, use HTTP recording and focus on fast script generation. And fast script generation, I mean you can use framework parameters in Neoload or correlation engines from LoadRunner or that kind of stuff. So if you correlate the dynamic data with a framework, then you can easily update between builds. Topic 2 is if the GUI on AX, using AX on average, it's still possible to use HTTP protocol. If it is topic 3, if it is fully WebSocket based and async calls all over the place, and then you need to switch to GUI level because then it will be too complex due to a lot of threads and asynchronous stuff. Topic 4, due to the vendors say GUI scripting is easy and blah blah blah. My opinion is GUI scripts needs also to be stable, so it takes development time. To my experience, if an HTTP script is stable, then it's stable. But a GUI script needs sometimes a curve to get it stable. So it needs attention. A GUI script is of course less technical. You can show the GUI and it's easy to explain what you are testing. And a GUI script can reduce maintenance effort. It can, but if it is still possible with HTTP, then use HTTP. But if it is like topic 3, then So it's WebSocket and async, then it reduces, but you need to think about it. Okay. Then one slide about web services. Yeah, this is not a full presentation of web services, but only I want to mention the main topics. To my opinion, it's pretty straightforward. Often a subset of existing functional tests can be used, so you can work close together with a functional test automation engineer. You can use the WSDL to import the SOAP actions. And also, again, you need to test wrong data format. And then I mean wrong test data. So not a wrong XML format, but wrong test data, so that you also test the error path. Of course, you need assertions. And the bullet about use response size check is, to my opinion, also important, because sometimes I've seen you miss value pairs in the response. So then all your assertions are right, but then you're missing some tags, and then you miss it with the assertion. So it's also best practice to do a response size check, because then you know that the size is what you expected. And if you miss an error, then you still know you get a response like this. And then the importance of test data, message size, large included attachment, and that kind of stuff. So it's important for parsing, memory usage, database requests, because I see often load tests, then you get some XML request or JSON or whatever, and it's like a functional subset, but they forgot about the size, and then you really miss some things about the things mentioned in this slide about parsing and memory and database use. And make sure that all operations and transformations are covered. It has to do with the paths you have to test, but this is a general reminder. Think about it. And to my opinion, if you want the web services, the security stuff, then try to capture that in a different test. Okay, so that's about web services. Then you have a load script, and then the general approach to validate it. Because I often see that a user has a load script and he tries to run it and he says, okay, no errors, and then start with a load scenario. But to my opinion, of course, it needs to be iterative, but if you start too early and too quickly with a full load test, then you maybe have too many cycles and you go back to your script and fix something. But if you validate your script really, then you know that your script is doing what you like it to do. And then you know that's okay. So 3 rules, and it's maybe for someone it's clear, but you have to validate it with 1 user, 1 iteration, then do a kind of test with 1 user, 10 iterations, and then do a kind of smoke test with 10 users, 10 iterations. So then you know that your load script is okay. And if you do that, you have to check things like this. Of course, the full log of your load test tool. Check your parameter substitution. Check the response time. Again, the recorded session. But this is also an important one. The server logs during replay. Or maybe if you have APM tools, you can check the sessions during your validation of your script. Check if pacing is working as expected. So, because if you check those things, then you know when you do a full run of a stress test or a peak load test or a duration test or whatever, then you know that your load script is okay and that the timing works correctly. And of course, you can check the GVM and that kind of stuff. And the last bullet, and that's also a best practice, I think. Sometimes you do a validation with one user and then you see it's already very slow, the system and the test. And to my opinion, then you have a performance problem, not a scalability problem, but a performance problem, and then report a performance issue. And if it is really bad, then you have to discuss what to do. But it's sometimes forgotten, and then they say, oh, it's slow, but just start with the load test, stress test, and that kind of stuff. But if you optimize first with one user, then you have a lot of benefit of that. Okay, that was the script validation, and then the scenario validation. Yeah, in a scenario, you group scripts together. I use always naming conventions for load profiles, baseline, stress, load, peak. Now, you can debate about the naming, but that's not the goal of this presentation. But if you keep it with a kind of load profile, then you know what kind of test it is. And the third one, keep the settings for the load profile fixed. And that's, yeah, important to my opinion, because I also did in the past minor changes to the load profile, and then I rerun the test, and then you have really different results. So if you make it as a best practice to get the load profile settings the same, then you don't have that problem, because you have a lot of options there. And I mentioned it's not a full list, but ramp up time, ramp down time, browser cache settings, static content, rendezvous times, pacing, think times, and that kind of stuff. So keep it fixed. Also, my best practice is like, if a user has an error, then I stop the user or kill the user or stop the iteration and start a new one. You can say, hey, you can do a retry or go on, but I have seen a lot of times collateral damage, so you get more errors than you need to know. So my best practice is stop a user and start a new one. Because if one step fails, there is a high risk that all other steps fails. And yeah, this rule does not apply for web services because they run independent. But for a normal user flow, stop the user and then start a new one. And the last bullet is, yeah, it's more when you do load testing, not yet in a CI/CD pipeline, but if you run tests and then you have results and you need to compare and you have changed settings and that kind of stuff in the system and the test. So if possible, store within the test results the run conditions, system and the test software version, but maybe thread pool settings, or if you are hunting for a problem and maybe you change the database pool settings or the log level, because everything has influence on the end results. And if you don't know the system and the test condition, then you are not able to compare. Or if you look a week after that, then you don't know the settings anymore. So it's more or less a best practice in general. Okay, and then a recap. because maybe it's a lot of information. This presentation is maybe also a kind of bullet list or a checklist or whatever. But if I give a recap, then the first important one, the test data must be in place before developing load scripts. Test data must be unique to each user session ID, and that's also related to that you know that the user sees his own test data. That's not only related to caching and that kind of stuff. The third one, pay strong attention to any detail of your load script and scenario. That's the presentation of this, because you need to have to think of more things than you are aware of. The fourth bullet is like use HTTP scripting protocol as possible, but if it compares too complex or the maintenance will be too high, then switch to GUI level. And the last one is automate the correlation, detect dynamic values in the script, and you can replace them then. If you take effort in this, then you have benefit of this all the time. And I've used it a lot of times, because else you do manual correlation over and over again. And if you do it in framework rules or correlation wizards, that kind of stuff, then you reduce the development time. Okay. So if you use this presentation as a kind of guideline when you're developing scripts, then, to my opinion, you get more effective tests. It does not has to do with perfection, but I've seen a lot of scripts or load tests which are load tests, but they forgot sometimes, or forgot, or test data is not correct, or the timing is not okay, or that kind of stuff. Then you have less effective tests, which are, I will not say meaningless, but less effective. So in this presentation, I've mentioned a lot of pieces: HTTP protocol, GUI level, parameterization, correlation, think time, pacing, that kind of stuff. But if you put them all together, then you build an effective test. That's it.
All right, thanks, Arjan. I was almost going to make the phone ringing because you were out of time. But I looked at the content and I saw there was only things like that, so that's why I see that Stain has connected as a guest. Stain is too shy to share his webcam at home, or because it says Stain at home. But he had a lot of topics to notes about your presentation. I think one of them, first of all, I think it's important. Something I didn't see in your presentation, and I think it's important to also note it down. Is once you do a test that's interacts and supposed to, I don't know, let's say create a quotation or create an order or whatever. The first thing is you may have your test running without any errors, but you could have the order is not saved and not stored in database. So the minimal is not because it happens that people is forgetting assertions. I know assertion is painful, but assertion at least make sure that your script is doing what it's supposed to do. So I think that's pretty strong. So it reminds me a bit of the presentation. So we had at PAX Scotland our friend. I forgot. But there was a dedicated session to that. Let me remind the name. I know him well. I met him several times, but never mind. So yeah, he did the 10 rules. So he named it the 10 rules for script design. I think there was a few questions by Stain, and one of the Stain is when he showed WebSockets. So Stain had pretty lot of bad experience with WebSockets. So he said, which tool are you using? when you test the WebSocket? Do you have any? Did you succeed? Tested? So it seems that from screenshots it was Neoload.
Yeah, that's true. But I think that was a very special case because that was a warehouse system, and the GUI state was maintained on the server. So each user has a kind of 100 meg on the server. It was a kind of mainframe application ported to Java, and it was the device was only painting the GUI, and it was sending WebSockets events all over the place to update the state of the GUI on the server. So if you miss one event, then you get completely lost. And there were synchronous, asynchronous events in the WebSocket channel. You have to pull for that kind of step. And or if you get a different screen pop up, then you are completely lost. So we handled that for almost 1 year, and then we decided to stop with that solution. And then we switched to
the GUI.
And then we switched to GUI level, and that was the solution in that case.
Got it. Jason Sikkoy has mentioned that had a few of these, but it was encrypted. So just to let you know, WebSocket is a transport layer like HTTP. So of course you can transport pure text, HTML, JSON. But it usually happens quite a lot that it's exchanging objects, or you can also exchange MQTT over WebSocket. So it doesn't mean that once it's encrypted, it's not possible. So for tools that has SDK, so in Neoload, for example, you can enhance the recording engine to allow you to decrypt the content. But you need to know how to crack and decode the content. That's one of the things. Stein had a small question. More like a note and get your opinion. So test as your script. Focus. So when you have an issue, if you have a single user and that single user is failing, there's a focus on exploratory testing. No think time, no pacing. Run small ad hoc tests and look at the behavior of the code. Move away from the GUI or HTTPS, fully integrate testing, and do more web service testing. Validate the feature by including feedback loops from production. What do you think? Agree or disagree?
Is the question also in the chat?
Yeah, it's in the chat.
Yeah, I think
I think once you have an issue of performance.
First part of the question. I missed the first part.
Yeah, the first question. He basically pushed it. This node has been pushed when you were starting referring. There's a one single user execution, and you get a lot of issues. Instead of running the load test, which doesn't make sense. If you have already performance problems with one user, you have to dig and get more details to figure out why it's so slow.
Yeah, move away from GUI or HTTPS, fully integrated testing, and do more web services testing. Yeah, okay. Yeah, of course, I agree with do as many web services testing as possible. But this presentation is more or less has the intention when you have to script a kind of flow through the GUI. And then because I've used it for a warehouse system and it was a handheld picker and it was not possible with web services, so it was a kind of state and we need to do it in the through the GUI. And then we start with HTTP and then we switch to GUI. So of course do more web services testing because now I'm at the Dutch tax department, and we do only web services testing with Gatling. So, if possible, so I agree, switch to web services testing as much as possible.
Jorik, I know that you have been designing and running tests with more than 1 million users on WebSockets. you have any question to Arjan?
Well, actually, not about WebSockets. I had a question about GUI testing again.
Okay, no problem.
I think you're not really a fan of testing the performance or simulating a user over the GUI by using the GUI and just simulate HTTP request. But don't you think it can becomes more necessary as more logic is transferred to the browser?
Yeah, so in my case, at the warehouse system, it was that complex, so we need to switch to the GUI. But to be honest, it was my first shot in 10 or 15 years that I really need to switch to the GUI. But I think if it becomes more complex, then, and that's what all other vendors say, like anyone, and they say, you have to switch to the GUI, but I think my quote is like, use HTTP, and if it is too complex, then switch to the GUI. And if it is a lot of asynchronous stuff, and you can't correlate, and your script become multi-threaded, and you need polling and that kind of stuff, then the decision can be switch to the GUI. And that's what I've seen also in another case.
I think so.
I think, I think nothing is impossible for protocol level. So
that's true. That's true. Yeah.
So I've been always fighting and proving that everything is possible with the protocol level. So I think sometimes people is moving quite simply to GUI because it's more a matter of being able to build the right design for the app. But to come to your next point, the problem is when you do complex asynchronous protocol-based scripts, you have to ask yourself, okay, so what do I measure? Because at the end you build a transaction, but what do you measure? I think yes, you have the objective, you're able to load, you are able to apply load to the system, but the KPIs that you're fishing for, especially the response times, it's not realistic. So that's why if you're targeting like you're good with a 1 million or 2 million user, I think it's easier with the protocol. So that you will make the objective with the protocol, but you need some GUI somewhere to at least have the response time measured, because otherwise you will report false data to your project.
Yeah, that's true, because that was also we got it technically up and running, and then the second thing was how do we measure response times, and that was really terrible. But it's my message is there are a lot of people say switch to the GUI because then it's okay, but that's really not true.
Yeah, agreed. Jörg, do you have any other questions?
No, not really. Actually, it's good to write up some some best practices of performance testing. So no questions on that.
I also want to know, maybe I missed. It's difficult to catch everything in 10 or 15 slides, but it's more or less my best. What to my opinion, what I use daily in scripting and developing load scripts, and also the topic of test data is really forgotten often, and then people start scripting and we need test data, and then what about scripts? You need to have test data in place first. That's really always or most of the times forgotten, or in a later in a stage too late.
Or not forgotten. Or not forgotten, or especially let's say you're asking for 100, 500 accounts, but you get 10 accounts instead.
Yeah.
Then you can say, but the project says, but it's very hard to create accounts. So this is the only thing I can get you. So that's.
And also the topic about test data related to an account, then because I've seen issues with session data, and that's so if it is possible correlating test data to a user account, then you catch errors in your load script, which you never we're able to capture, because if you not correlate the test data to a user, then you maybe miss something.
All right, so it's look at the time. It's 7 p.m. So it's normally it's Jurek. Now it's time to Jurek to go on stage and rock. So I would like to thank you,